As soon as they stepped into the Hotel Vesper, Mark and Emily felt as if they had traveled back in time. The ornate furnishings and antique decor made the hotel look like it had been frozen in time. The couple had booked a weekend getaway at the historic hotel to celebrate their second anniversary, and they were both excited to explore the property and relax. As they checked in at the reception desk, Mark and Emily couldn't help but notice how quiet the hotel was. There didn't seem to be any other guests around, which struck them as odd considering the grandeur of the establishment. However, they shrugged it off, thinking that maybe they had just arrived during an off-season. The receptionist handed them their keys and directed them to their room on the third floor. As they walked down the dimly lit hallway, Emily shivered, feeling a cold draft. Mark put his arm around her, assuring her that everything would be fine. When they reached their room, they found it to be elegant and spacious, with a four-poster bed and antique furnishings. They immediately made themselves at home, unpacking their bags and settling in for the night. As they lay in bed, they could hear the creaking of the old building settling, which made them feel even more isolated. The next morning, Mark and Emily headed down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. But to their surprise, the restaurant was completely empty. The tables were set, and the buffet was fully stocked, but there was no one there to serve them. They looked at each other, bewildered and slightly unnerved. After waiting for a few minutes, they decided to explore the hotel and see if they could find any other guests. They walked through the empty corridors and searched the common areas, but there was no one to be found. The hotel was completely deserted. As they made their way back to their room, they heard a sound coming from the end of the hallway. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and more distinct. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy object across the floor. Mark and Emily exchanged a worried glance and approached the source of the noise. As they turned the corner, they saw a man standing in front of one of the hotel room doors. He was tall, with a pale complexion and dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Excuse me," Emily said. "We were just wondering what's going on here. We haven't seen any other guests since we arrived." The man turned to them, and they could see that his eyes were sunken and bloodshot. He looked at them for a moment before replying in a low, monotone voice. "There are no other guests. You're the only ones here." Mark and Emily felt a chill run down their spines. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. They had booked a weekend at a supposedly luxurious hotel, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. "What do you mean?" Mark asked. "We saw other guests yesterday. There were people at the reception desk, and the restaurant was set for breakfast." The man's expression didn't change. "There are no other guests," he repeated. "You're the only ones here." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into one of the hotel rooms. Mark and Emily stood there in shock, unsure of what to do next. They decided to return to their room and try to figure out what was going on. They searched the room for any clues or information, but found nothing. As the day progressed, they started to feel increasingly uneasy. They were completely isolated in this old hotel, with no cell phone reception and no way to contact the outside world. They had no idea what was happening, but they knew they had to get out of there as soon as possible. But every time they tried to leave the hotel, they found themselves back in their room. The corridors seemed to twist and turn, leading them right back to where they started. It was as if the hotel was playing a twisted game with them. As the night drew near, Mark and Emily became more and more frightened. They could hear strange noises coming from the walls and floors, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They huddled together in bed, trying to block out the sounds, but it was no use. Just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they heard a knock at the door. Mark cautiously approached it and opened it, only to find the same strange man they had seen earlier. "You need to leave," the man said urgently. "You need to get out of here now." Mark and Emily didn't need to be told twice. They quickly grabbed their belongings and followed the man down the empty corridors. As they reached the lobby, they saw that the front doors were wide open. "Go," the man yelled. "Run." Mark and Emily didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted out of the hotel, gasping for breath as they emerged into the cold night air. As they turned back to look at the hotel, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The windows of the hotel were glowing with an eerie blue light, and they could see the silhouette of the strange man standing in one of the rooms, watching them. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, and the hotel was plunged into darkness. Mark and Emily stumbled away from the hotel, shaken and terrified. They didn't stop running until they had reached the safety of their car, and they didn't look back until they were miles away. As they drove home, they couldn't help but wonder what had happened at the Hotel Vesper. They knew they would never be able to forget the strange events that had occurred there, and they knew they would never be able to shake the feeling that something sinister was still lurking within those walls. Victoria Bloom, a world-renowned actress, arrived at the Hotel Montague on a warm Friday evening in July. She had booked the presidential suite for the weekend, a luxurious room that came with a panoramic view of the city's skyline, a private hot tub, and a grand piano. Victoria had been looking forward to this weekend for months. It was a much-needed break from the grueling schedule of her current film shoot. As soon as she entered the suite, Victoria was struck by its opulence. The room was tastefully decorated with fine art, plush carpets, and ornate chandeliers. The bed was covered in silky sheets and fluffy pillows, and the hot tub was already bubbling with warm water. Victoria couldn't wait to unwind and relax in this sumptuous space. But as the night fell and Victoria settled into bed, she began to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling noise in the corner of the room, a sudden chill that made her shiver. Victoria dismissed these sensations as the product of a vivid imagination. However, as the night progressed, the strange occurrences became more frequent and pronounced. The sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway, the feeling of someone breathing down her neck, the eerie whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Victoria tried to rationalize these experiences, blaming them on the hotel's old age and her own fatigue. However, as the hours ticked by, her unease turned into terror. She felt trapped in the room with an unseen presence that seemed to be watching her every move. The next morning, Victoria reported her strange experiences to the hotel management, who were initially dismissive. However, upon learning that the suite Victoria was staying in was known to be haunted, they agreed to move her to a different room. Victoria was relieved but also curious. She decided to investigate the room's dark past and uncover the truth behind the haunting. Over the next few days, Victoria delved deep into the history of the presidential suite. She learned that it had once belonged to a wealthy businessman who had an affair with a young maid. When his wife found out about the affair, she confronted the maid and fired her. The maid was devastated and committed suicide in the room. Victoria was horrified by this tragic story and couldn't shake the feeling that the maid's spirit was still present in the room, seeking revenge for the injustice done to her. She decided to confront the spirit and put it to rest. Late one night, Victoria lit candles and placed them around the room. She sat on the bed and called out to the spirit, asking for forgiveness and offering her help to move on to the next world. At first, nothing happened, but then the temperature in the room dropped and the candles flickered wildly. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was the maid's ghost, and she was furious. Victoria's heart raced as she watched the ghostly figure of the maid move slowly towards her. She could see the anger in her eyes, and she knew that she was in grave danger. "Please forgive me," Victoria said, trembling with fear. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. Let me help you move on." But the maid's ghost didn't seem to hear her. She continued to move closer, her features contorted with rage. Victoria could feel a cold wind blowing through the room, and she knew that she had to act quickly. With a deep breath, Victoria stood up from the bed and faced the ghost head-on. "Please, listen to me," she said firmly. "You don't have to stay here anymore. You can move on and find peace." Suddenly, the maid's ghost stopped in her tracks. Victoria could see a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, and she knew that she had reached her. The ghost began to fade away, and Victoria felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had confronted the spirit and put it to rest, and she knew that she would never forget this experience. As she left the presidential suite and checked out of the hotel, Victoria felt a sense of closure. She had uncovered the truth behind the haunting, and she had helped the spirit move on to the next world. But she also knew that she would never forget the terror she had felt during those long nights in the haunted suite. Years later, when she looked back on that weekend, Victoria would still shiver at the memory of the maid's ghost. But she would also remember the strength and courage she had found within herself and the knowledge that sometimes, even the most terrifying experiences can lead to a greater sense of understanding and compassion. The sun was just starting to set as the group of friends arrived at the Hotel Zephyr. It was a beautiful old hotel that had been renovated with modern amenities, making it the perfect place for a weekend party. The group consisted of 6 friends: Rachel, Tom, Sara, John, Lisa, and Mike. They were all looking forward to letting loose and having a good time. Rachel, the organizer of the trip, checked them in at the front desk while the others waited in the lobby. As they made their way up to their rooms, they could feel the excitement building inside of them. They were all ready for a weekend of fun and relaxation. Their rooms were on the 3rd floor, with Tom and Sara sharing one room, John and Lisa another, and Rachel and Mike in the last room. After they dropped off their bags, they headed to the hotel bar for some drinks and to catch up on each other's lives. The night was going well, and everyone was having a great time. But then, as the clock struck midnight, there was a sudden blackout. The hotel was plunged into darkness, and the sound of screams echoed through the halls. The group huddled together, trying to stay calm as they heard the sounds of people running and shouting in the distance. Rachel, the natural leader of the group, decided that they should stay put until they could figure out what was going on. But as the minutes turned into hours, the tension grew thicker. They tried to call the front desk, but the phones were dead. They couldn't leave their room because the elevators were out of order and the stairwells were pitch black. As the night wore on, they heard strange noises coming from outside their door, scratching, scraping, and thumping. They tried to ignore it, thinking that it was just their imaginations, but the noises continued, getting louder and more intense. Finally, Sara couldn't take it anymore. She suggested that they try to find a way out, to which Rachel reluctantly agreed. They decided to use their cell phone flashlights to navigate their way through the hotel. As they made their way through the dark corridors, they could hear the sounds of chaos all around them. The emergency lights were flickering, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The group was on edge, their hearts racing as they tried to find a way out of the hotel. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the rooms. Rachel, the bravest of them all, went to investigate with the others close behind. What they found inside that room would haunt them forever. The walls were covered in blood, and there was a body lying on the bed, its throat slit. As they backed away in horror, they heard a low growling sound coming from the darkness behind them. That's when they realized that they were not alone. Something evil was lurking in the shadows, and they were its prey. The group turned to run, but before they could make it to the door, they heard a loud thump, and the door slammed shut. They were trapped inside the room with the dead body, and the growling was getting louder. Rachel quickly scanned the room, looking for anything they could use to defend themselves. Her eyes fell on a lamp on the bedside table. She grabbed it and swung it at the darkness, hoping to hit whatever was making the noise. There was a yelp of pain and then silence. The group waited, their breaths coming in short gasps, but nothing happened. They cautiously moved towards the door, and this time, it opened without resistance. They stepped out into the hallway, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. They were on the 5th floor, and they knew they had to make their way down to the lobby. They could hear the sounds of chaos all around them, but they were determined to make it out alive. As they made their way down the stairs, they encountered more dead bodies and signs of a struggle. They were all shaken, but they knew they had to keep moving. When they finally made it to the lobby, they saw that it was in shambles. The furniture was overturned, and there were more bodies lying on the ground. They made their way to the front desk, hoping to find a phone that worked, but it was empty. They were completely cut off from the outside world. The group cautiously made their way towards the front desk, their hearts racing with fear. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sound of chaos echoed through the halls, and the smell of smoke filled the air. As they approached the front desk, they heard a faint whispering sound coming from behind the counter. They stopped in their tracks, listening intently. The whispers grew louder, and they realized that there was someone or something hiding behind the counter. As they peeked over the counter, they saw a figure huddled in the corner. It was an old woman, and she was muttering to herself. The group exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. They had heard stories of strange happenings at the Hotel Zephyr, but they had never expected something like this. As they approached her, the old woman looked up, and they saw that her eyes were completely black, devoid of any life. She lunged at them, her hands outstretched, and they stumbled backwards, falling to the ground. The group scrambled to their feet and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the old woman's screams echoing through the halls as they made their way towards the exit. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the smell of smoke grew stronger with each passing moment. As they burst through the front doors of the hotel, they were hit by a blast of cold night air. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, their hearts racing. They looked back at the hotel, and to their horror, they saw flames engulfing the building. They knew that they had survived something unimaginable, and they would never forget that fateful night at the Hotel Zephyr. The group had seen and experienced things that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They knew that they were lucky to have made it out alive, and they couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if they hadn't found a way to escape. The memory of that night would haunt them forever. As a young journalist, Claire was always looking for a big story that would catapult her career to the next level. So when she stumbled upon the Hotel Mornam, a rundown hotel with a dark history, she knew she had found her next investigative piece. The hotel's website boasted about its prime location and luxurious accommodations, but Claire was skeptical. She had heard rumors about the hotel's past, about mysterious deaths and disappearances that had occurred within its walls. But Claire was determined to uncover the truth. When Claire arrived at the hotel, she was immediately struck by its eerie atmosphere. The lobby was dimly lit, with antique furniture that seemed to have been untouched for decades. The hotel manager, a thin man with a greasy comb-over, greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the Hotel Mornam," he said. "We're so glad to have you with us." Claire checked into her room, which was small and cramped, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. She sat down at the desk and began to research the hotel's history. She soon discovered that the Hotel Mornam had a dark past. Over the years, several guests had died mysteriously within its walls, and many more had disappeared without a trace. The hotel had been investigated by the police, but no evidence of foul play had ever been found. Claire knew she had to dig deeper. She began to interview the hotel staff and guests, but everyone seemed to be hiding something. The hotel manager was evasive, and the guests were tight-lipped. One night, as Claire was working in her room, she heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. She cautiously opened her door and peered out, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off and went back to work. But the strange occurrences continued. Claire heard footsteps outside her door, whispers in the middle of the night, and strange knocking sounds. She began to feel like she was being watched, like something was lurking in the shadows. One day, while exploring the hotel's basement, Claire discovered a hidden room. Inside, she found a collection of old newspapers and documents that detail the hotel's history. As she read through them, she felt a growing sense of dread. The documents revealed that the hotel's previous owner had been a serial killer who had used the hotel as a hunting ground. He had lured his victims to the hotel, where he had tortured and murdered them before disposing of their bodies. Claire was horrified. She knew she had to get out of the hotel as soon as possible, but when she tried to leave, she found that the doors were all locked from the outside. She was trapped. As the hours ticked by, Claire began to hear strange noises coming from a hallway outside her room. She could hear footsteps, whispers, and the sound of a knife being sharpened. Claire knew that she was in grave danger. She huddled in a corner of her room, praying for someone to come and rescue her. But no one came. As the night wore on, Claire's fear continued to intensify. Every creak and shuffle outside her door made her heart race. The strange noises that she had dismissed as the old building settling in earlier now seemed ominous and alarming. The only thought that dominated her mind was the impending danger that lurked outside. Claire tried to use her phone to call for help, but to her dismay, there was no signal in the hotel. The isolation of the situation only made it worse. She had to face whatever was coming at her all alone. Suddenly, the door to her room creaked open, and Claire's heart skipped a beat. She screamed and scrambled backward, knocking over a chair as she did so. She watched in horror as a figure stepped into the room, brandishing a large knife. As he advanced towards her, Claire's eyes darted to the man's face. Her eyes widened in horror as she recognized the hotel manager, the same man who had checked her in with a greasy comb-over and a fake smile. She realized in that moment that the hotel manager had been the one responsible for the deaths and disappearances within the hotel. "Welcome to the Hotel Mornham," he said, his voice laced with malice. "You're not leaving." Claire's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to escape. She tried to run, but the manager was too quick for her. He lunged at her with the knife, and Claire stumbled, trying to keep her balance. The room spun, and she fell to the ground, the breath knocked out of her. As the hotel manager raised his knife to strike, Claire's hand fell upon a heavy lamp on the nightstand. Her fingers curled around it as she swung it with all her might. The lamp connected with the side of the manager's head with a sickening thud. The manager crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Claire scrambled to her feet and ran to the door, pounding on it with all her might. Finally, it gave way, and she burst into the hallway, her heart racing. The hallway was empty, but she could still hear the manager's breathing behind her, and his footsteps pounding on the floor. Claire ran down the hallway, past the empty rooms and the faded wallpaper, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the stairwell, she heard a sound behind her. She turned to see the manager, now fully conscious, lumbering towards her with the knife in his hand. She could see the murderous intent in his eyes, and she knew that she had to move quickly. Claire didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the stairs, her legs burning with exertion. She could hear the manager's footsteps getting closer and closer, and she knew that he was almost upon her. She burst through the front door and out into the street, gasping for air. She looked back at the hotel, her eyes full of terror and relief. She knew that she had uncovered a horrifying truth about the hotel's dark past, but she also knew that she had survived and that she had a story that would make her career. The Hotel Ascension was a towering monolith of steel and glass that rose up from the heart of the city like a sentinel of luxury and wealth. Its sleek, modern design had made it a favorite among business travelers and tourists alike, with its spacious rooms, gourmet restaurants, and breathtaking views of the skyline. But for a group of strangers who found themselves trapped in its elevator one fateful night, the hotel would become synonymous with terror and despair. The elevator itself was a marvel of engineering, with polished metal walls that gleamed in the soft ambient lighting. The floor was covered in plush red carpeting, and the overhead speakers played a soothing instrumental melody that was meant to calm the nerves of even the most anxious traveler. But as the group of strangers stepped into the elevator, they could sense that something was wrong. The air inside the compartment was stale and musty, as if it hadn't been used in months. The doors slid shut with a metallic clang, and the elevator began its ascent towards the upper floors. At first, everything seemed normal. The elevator hummed softly as it climbed higher and higher, the digital display above the doors ticking off the floors one by one. But then, without warning, the elevator shuddered to a stop between the 12th and 13th floors. For a few moments, the group of strangers stood frozen in shock, their hearts pounding in their chests. They tried pressing the emergency call button, but there was no response. They shouted and banged on the doors, but their efforts were met with silence. As they waited, the group of strangers tried to pass the time by making small talk and joking around. But beneath the surface, they could feel a sense of unease growing, a feeling that something wasn't right. Then, the hallucinations started. At first, it was just a subtle distortion of reality, a flicker of movement in the corner of their eyes, a brief and inexplicable sense of disorientation. But as time went on, the hallucinations became more intense and terrifying. One man saw his dead wife beckoning him towards an ethereal light, while another was convinced he was being stalked by a faceless entity that seemed to lurk just out of sight. A woman in the group suddenly started speaking in tongues, her voice low and guttural, as if she was possessed by some otherworldly force. As the hallucinations continued, the group began to realize that they weren't just experiencing a malfunctioning elevator. They were caught in the grip of something far more sinister. Every sound, every sensation seemed to be amplified and distorted, like the elevator was a portal to another dimension, a dark and malevolent realm that threatened to consume them all. But as the group tried to make sense of what was happening, they began to turn on each other. Arguments erupted, accusations flew, and the sense of isolation and desperation grew stronger with each passing moment. Just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, the elevator suddenly lurched into motion again, descending rapidly towards the lobby. But as they emerged from the compartment, they found themselves in a world that was both familiar and alien. The hotel lobby was now shrouded in darkness, with twisted and gnarled shapes lurking in the shadows. The group felt as if they were walking through molasses, their movements sluggish and clumsy, as if they were weighed down by some unseen force. As they stumbled through the lobby, the group realized that they were no longer alone. Something was following them, something that seemed to be getting closer with each passing moment. It wasn't until they stumbled upon the source of the darkness that they realized the true horror of their situation. The source of the darkness was a small room tucked away in the corner of the hotel's basement, hidden from view by a heavy iron door. The group of strangers had never noticed it before, but now it loomed before them like a gateway to hell. As they approached the room, they could feel the temperature drop, as if they were walking into an icy void. The air was thick with a stench of decay, and a sense of dread washed over them like a tidal wave. The iron door creaked open with a rusty groan, revealing a small chamber that was pitch black except for a single flickering light bulb. In the center of the room was a small pedestal, on which rested a silver urn. The group hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then, as if drawn by some unseen force, they approached the urn. As they touched it, they felt a surge of energy flow through their bodies, like an electric shock. Images flashed before their eyes, visions of death and destruction, of suffering and torment. They knew then that the urn was a vessel for the spirits of the dead, and that it had been calling out to them through the elevator. But as they tried to leave the room, they found that the door was now sealed shut. They were trapped, with no way out. The darkness closed in around them, suffocating and oppressive. They could feel the presence of the spirits growing stronger, as if they were being drawn closer to the realm of the dead. In a final desperate bid for survival, the group made a run for the front doors, hoping to escape the malevolent spirits that pursued them. But as they burst through the doors into the night, they realized that the darkness was everywhere. It was in the sky, in the air, in their very souls. In the end, only a handful of them made it out alive, scared and traumatized by their ordeal in the elevator. They would never forget the terror they had experienced, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare that had no escape. And they knew that no matter where they went, they would always carry a piece of that darkness with them,